Hey,
Hey, welcome back. All right, how have you been for these past 2 weeks? We haven't actually spoken since the last DevRel AMA.
no, not really. No, I mean it's been busy. It's been busy. We are working on a couple of things, which has taken a lot of my attention. Partially, we're still hiring. We're still trying to find new DevRel, so that obviously takes time. Another thing as well is I moved all of the docs into the monorepo, which is probably really unexciting for everyone apart from me and the like 5 or 6 really sick community members who do also contribute to the docs. The reason for that is that I can then kind of automate loads of stuff. So yeah, it just makes my life a lot easier. And it also means that, we don't accidentally leave something out and something's out of date. And yeah, so it's more just kind of boring stuff. But we have a lot of exciting development stuff happening. So that's fun. But yeah,
Yeah,
maybe don't jump right into that yet. We can wait though, or we can go straight into it, or yeah.
yeah, just in a bit because I actually was planning to like crack this really bad joke, like our one and only Max, and then ask you to go through the because you're one and only right now as our DevRel. So that would have been the terrible joke, and then I would have asked you to like go through the position once again, given the fact that these good people over here in the audience are probably a good audience for the DevRel role that we currently have open.
So DevRel means DevRel's. I mean, DevRel's pretty new. It's only as like a job. But it's something that I think a lot of the people here who are like either kind of FOSS used to like the kind of FOSS environment, the open source environment, and the crypto environment as well, kind of get you know as a role, and it's basically the core. There's a couple of core elements to it, and then there's a lot of other stuff as well, which is kind of where the fun happens. So the core stuff is, the things that you really need to have a successful open source project that other people engage with and build on, but also run nodes for. And that's good documentation and it's good community support. Right? Those are like the two main things to do with DevRel. It's making sure that you can help people out, either in terms of people building stuff or people wanting to run nodes and running into problems. And, in community channels and chats, Matrix, Discord, Telegram, wherever, as well as making sure that the documentation is as good as possible to allow people to do that. And then there's also the other thing as well, which is doing talks and doing workshops, right? Those are like the three core things. And then the other stuff that comes around it is then, yeah, where it starts to get a bit more fun. So doing maybe it's doing stuff like videos for node setups, right? Like I know we had a lot of people asking us for that as well. It's also, writing tutorials, writing demo apps, all of this kind of fun stuff that comes around it, and also there's a lot of intersection as well, obviously between the growth team. So, also looking at more like technical ambassador stuff and all of this kind of stuff. Basically, that's what DevRel is, and that's what the job is that we're hiring for. And if you have coding skills that are front endy stuff, then that's like a really nice bonus because I hate front end coding. But yeah,
And also evangelism. That's my favorite word still.
I really don't like it as a word. I've got to say,
No, it's hilarious, I
it's insane. I think. Um,
think.
it's just kind of mad to describe what you're doing as evangelizing. It's a very, I don't know, it feels like a very Silicon Valley way of like conceptualizing what you do. The idea that you're like evangelizing about a particular piece of technology. But yeah, I think that's a broader chat about the fact that, all of this stuff is social technology at its core, right? Like it's technology that allows people to do things. In the case of Nym, interact on the internet without being, you know, spied on by machine learning dragnets. But yeah, evangelizing is always I don't know, it's a strange word. I prefer the idea that we're like a cozy support for people who want to get involved.
Machine learning dragnet. I like that a lot, actually. Maybe I'm gonna steal that from you. Nick is asking, just related to the DevRel role, how do you measure success? Because if you do apply for the developer relations role, by the way, then this gentleman over here, Max, will be your boss. How will you measure success of people?
we are like we're ideally looking for someone who is another phrase that I hate, but one that everyone knows, crypto native, someone who's like been around in the space for a while and understands the ins and outs of like how online developer communities kind of like function and like what the just like kind of what the general vibe is in this kind of space. That's a big bonus. How to define success. I mean, defining success in this role is like in terms of just a personal thing of how you do the job, it's like a certain amount of are you able to be relatively, are you able to kind of be a self-starter with stuff in terms of, I don't know, every week with the docs, there's some new stuff that we can add. There's some stuff that is maybe kind of an idea of how we could do something better that you get when you're like a lot of the time when I'm actually setting up nodes, I'll check my own docs, right? Which is kind of a sign of that you write good documentation when you actually want to check it yourself when you're doing something. And sometimes you think you look at it and you think, we could do that better, So then obviously kind of to a certain extent that this kind of self-criticality is obviously a great aspect to have, as well as being a self-starter of being like, oh hey, I kind of saw this, so yeah, I just did it, or we could just do this. And then being able to kind of go off and do that. So kind of enough independence that you just kind of do stuff, within the bounds of what we have on our plate. I would say someone who's also able to like be quite flexible. It's kind of a weird role. You're doing some stuff that's kind of maybe with growth team. You're doing some stuff with a core team. You're going to be giving technical support, but then you're also going to be writing. And then maybe you're also going to be giving a workshop. Maybe that's all going to happen in like a week or like 3 days or something. So kind of being able to kind of jump between those different situations is also really good. In terms of like DevRel more broadly, then what you count as success is like, I mean, are people able to just like read the guide to set up a mixnode and just do it and not have any problems? I think that's like one indicator that, hey, that's cool. Something is like, successful. In a way, actually, it's kind of like you're almost like working yourself out of the job, because it's like if the docs are good enough, then maybe you don't have to ask in community channels, But I think in a broader sense, it's like also just getting people to build on this, right? So which I will talk about later on. Obviously, this week we had the Rust SDK docs came out, right? So people can start to like work with the pre-release of that. Cool.
I already primed people that we're going to be talking about that because the blog post just dropped. I had a few questions planned about that.
Yeah. So, so it's also, DevRel has two roles. It's support, but it's also getting people to build. So without like putting metrics on it, because I don't really want to do that, but, seeing like a general increase in the number of devs who are building or want to build on this, and, more people applying for grants, just getting people to be building with Nym, I think is that's like an indicator of like maybe like the long-term success of DevRel, making it as frictionless as possible for more people to build on it. So that was a really broad answer to your question. I hope that answers it.
I think it did. To me, it did. And then maybe one more question about the DevRel role. Run Forest is asking, like if the deadlines are being met and things are improved, if you put them next to each other, there should be a significant improvement at least. That's what I kind of imagine to it. Is that correct? For example, documentation, relations, new partnerships, or improvements in that area.
I didn't get the first bit of that. Let me try and read it back.
I also don't fully understand the question, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
Please rephrase it. Run Forest.
Yeah.
And while we're waiting, an unknown person, Dusko, is asking, when name browser, sir?
I don't want to say soon, because I always say soon. I mean, look, Harry talked about it last week on the community call, this kind of like VPN-ish kind of Nym plugin, browser extension-y kind of affair, whatever this is. Soonish TM, right?
Soonish TM. Well, that's new.
Soonish TM. I'm just reading Run Forest's question now. Oh, you mean like, okay. So it's what you're basically saying, Forest, is like the mark of a successful new addition to the DevRel team would be if you look at documentation before and after they got here, then stuff would be like smoother or something. It would kind of flow better. I mean, in a way, yes, right? Because there's one of those interesting things when you work with something a lot, you kind of can't see the forest for the trees. Not to necessarily riff on your name, but it really fits. So actually like having actually having new people like looking at the docs, and this is especially why I value the community contributions as well. They will look at the docs from a perspective that's not of the person that just wrote it, so they'll spot things, right? And I think that's also like that is the sign of a good addition to the team. Definitely would be also like coming in and being like, oh hey, there's kind of maybe we could do this better, maybe this could be smoother, you know? So yeah, if that's kind of what you were talking about, Forrest, then yeah.
All right. Well, before I think we have a few community questions, but before that, maybe let's speak a little bit little bit to the Rust SDK.
Yeah.
Let's maybe summarize what it means and what it will enable, because it's from what I understand, it's pretty huge news that we finally dropped it.
It's really cool. Okay, so it's a pre-release of the SDK. Why am I saying it's a pre-release? For a couple of reasons. One is like right now it's relatively stable, but some things may change a bit in the future. Okay, so it's not like completely, absolutely 100% stable right now. The other thing is the way that Rust dependencies are distributed, right? Is through a package management system, which is called Cargo. And Rust dependencies, in a lot of other languages, they're called libraries. In Rust, they're called crates, right? All the dependencies are there on a website called crates.io, which is basically a list of all of the public Rust dependencies that you can import into your application. So right now, the crate isn't on crates.io, because there's still some work to be done. There's a lot of dependencies internally that we would have to be uploading, and this is kind of a bigger project. That said, you can still download it. You just import it from GitHub instead of crates.io. It's quite a marginal difference. And before I jump into it too much, Serbs Marine, still absolutely sick name, by the way. What kind of things could change? Really minor stuff. In terms of like working with it to create clients, load keys, all of this kind of stuff, this stuff is going to stay pretty stable. Okay, so you can basically full steam ahead on it is what don't worry about it too much. So it's almost like a very public release thing, but it's kind of still a semi pre-release, you know, for the heads, for the 21 people in here. So should I speak a bit more broadly, Sudo, about just like what the SDK is? And
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
okay. All right, cool. Anyone who, so an SDK is a software development kit. And what's the point? Why do we have them? The reason that they exist is basically to make the development process as frictionless as possible. I've been in this situation. I'm sure a lot of other people have been in this situation. If I can just, in whatever language I'm writing in, TypeScript, Rust, Python, whatever, if I'm looking for some kind of functionality for the piece of code that I'm writing, and I can just import that as a library or as a dependency to my project, and then just use it, that is an incredibly smooth development process, right? You don't have to think about it. And so that means that actually getting more people to integrate with Nym, because the functionality that we're talking about here with the SDK is connecting to the mixnet and sending messages through the mixnet. Now, there's other functionality that will come later, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But right now, you can think of the Rust SDK. It's a dependency that you can pull in that allows you to connect to the mixnet. It allows you to create a client, allows you to make keys, load keys, and basically do all of the stuff that you want to do if you're sending network traffic through the mixnet. So the SDK basically, as well as smoothing out that development process, how it smooths out the development process, it does this in two ways. Previously, what you would have to do is you would have to have an application. You'd have to have some application code that would connect to either a WebSocket client or a SOX 5 client that was running as like a separate process on your machine. From the development side, that was annoying. You had to run multiple clients. It was kind of messy. I had this when I was writing the demo for Barcelona. I had a terminal window with 5 screens in it because 2 of them were just Nym clients that I had to be running to make sure that everything worked. But what the SDK does is it allows you to embed a client in your application process. So that's now immediately a lot less stressful to develop with. But also it means you can make apps that then can just kind of abstract or kind of hide away the fact that there's a Nym client there from a user. So it pushes everything under the hood a lot more, which for both a developer and a user is great. The other thing that SDKs do, which is particularly good for developers, is it basically provides a really nice interface. And what an interface is, you can think of as it's kind of an abstraction layer. The good example is previously, if you were working with Rust and you wanted to And people can find this as well in our old WebSocket client code examples in the monorepo. What you had to do was you had to construct a JSON object with all of the stuff in it that you wanted to send through the mixnet, and then you had to have some logic that checked if there was a WebSocket connection to a Nym client running, and then you had to manually kind of poke all of this information through the mixnet, and then you had to also write some logic that would then listen to the WebSocket and wait for a message to come back. Doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to what you can now do with the SDK, which is one function, which is just client.send a string. And then you can also, there's another function, which is just client, I think it's called client wait and listen or something. So, basically these things that previously were, maybe 40 lines of code are now two functions that you can just call without thinking about. So again, it's all about kind of smoothing and abstracting this development process to just make it like something that you don't have to think about as much from the perspective of a developer. Yeah, that broadly is kind of what an SDK is and why SDKs are great. The TypeScript SDK was another instance of this. The TypeScript SDK, it took this blob of WASM, right, which was our WebAssembly client, it kind of abstracted it away from the developer. It put it in a web worker and just provided a nice interface to it. Again, instead of having to do all of this gnarly stuff manually, there's just a couple of functions that you could call, and then you were listening to the client that you've just created without having to write a load of gnarly code telling it to create something. So that's it. In terms of the functionality of the SDK, the Rust SDK, it's going to work in the same way as the TypeScript SDK, in that there's going to be different components to these SDKs. The three kind of main components that we can envisage right now. So you have the mixnet component. This is functionality that allows you to create or load clients, connect to the mixnet with them, and send traffic to and from the mixnet. You have Coconut functionality, as the name would suggest, will be the kind of functionality involved in interacting with Coconut credentials in an app. So probably making them, spending them, checking for them in an application, all of the logic that you would need both as an application sender and also like maybe you can think of an application backend as well that would need them. And then finally, you also have the kind of Nix validator stuff as well. So this would be functionality that would allow you to interact with the Nix chain and smart contracts on the Nix chain as well, constructing transactions, sending transactions, and querying the chain as well. So if you think of both SDKs like this, as this kind of component-based thing, right now, the mixnet component for both of these things is what has been released. And there is also some upcoming work on the TypeScript SDK as well that I can maybe talk about later if people are interested as well, to flesh out some more of the mixnet related functionality that is exposed to developers.
Sounds super interesting. To me, as a full noob, it sounds like it is going to make development much easier when it comes to some aspects of.
I will actually say there was a little developer tool that I've been working on and off for a while, which was partially, I think, like good developer tools do. They kind of come from frustration when you're building something. So I was building this little thing that basically you could imagine you could send it, you could ask it to just send messages to an address like on a metronome, or for instance, it would listen for incoming messages, right? So it was just good for when I was building the demo application in Barcelona. It was annoying that I also had to kind of constantly re-trigger manually sending myself this message through the mixnet just to check that my service provider was working. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll just build this little dev tool, which I'm still working on. I'm hopefully get it done soon. Before the SDK came out, it was like kind of disgusting looking code. And then I thought, oh, okay, the SDK, I can start playing around with the SDK. I'll just mess around with that. And, it like reduced, I cut like 90 lines of code, basically, just like immediately. Like it made it that much just simpler, as well as the fact that the client is embedded in the process. So I can just it removes the kind of strange bits of friction from developing a Nym app compared to developing other kind of apps. Now it's just like have some logic that will create a client for me. It'll log the address, and then I can just start doing stuff. So that's like a really good example why SDKs are cool in general, but also like why in the case of Nym, where you have this other client, it's particularly important, I think.
If you want further info, then make sure to read the blog post. And also, if you have questions or like any observations regarding the SDK, then you can leave them here on Discord. And Max is checking Discord fairly often, so he'll get back to you. Now, moving on to the first community question. BAP is new to the community. They're asking about whether there is a way to deploy testnet locally or if there's an existing testnet, which actually I think is a really good question because I did hear that we were about to start up another testnet, but I'm not sure what the status is. So maybe let's talk about that first.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, right, when you think of testnets, because if you're just thinking like blockchain space, then just a testnet is enough. But obviously, Nym is not just a blockchain at all. It's a blockchain and a mixnet. So that's kind of makes it. It sounds like, oh no, that's even worse. We are setting up a new blockchain testnet. What that means is there will be a different smart contract on there that has the list of mix nodes that exist, but that doesn't necessarily help you in terms of setting up you're imagining kind of like a development net mixnet, I imagine. There's two things that I can kind of say to that. Right now, there is no quick way of like, you may be, running something in Docker to just say, boom, spin me up 3 mix nodes in a gateway so I can test stuff. That said, mainnet right now is not very congested and it runs pretty fast. When I was deving for this Barcelona demo that I did, I just actually used mainnet the whole time because it was absolutely fine to do so. But coming back to the Rust SDK, there is actually a way of injecting a different topology. And what do I mean by topology? When we refer to the network topology of the mixnet, it's basically just a fancy way of saying all of the mix nodes and gateways that currently exist and are available to mix traffic. And so actually with the Rust SDK, there is the possibility of defining like a certain set of mix nodes that you want to use. So you could use that in this kind of process. The downside would be at the moment you'd have to set up 3 mix nodes, which is like a bit of a pain.
They're asking about, I think that the reason for this question is to create services. So they go on, I would like to explore how to create services. I've installed Nym Connect and I'm able to configure Telegram to use it as a SOCKS 5, but I'd like to exchange real messages manually between 2 clients. I guess right now, since the mixnet is free, you can just do that on mainnet, right?
Yes, I would say what you should check out, Deb, is there's a tutorial for setting up like a very simple service provider, which is kind of looking at the architecture of you set up kind of user-facing code and a service with Nym. That's on the dev portal. That's still using the old model, the non-SDK model, but the architecture still stands. So I think that would be a good place to start. And if you're wanting to exchange real messages manually between 2 clients, then I would also look into the SDKs as well, right? Because you don't necessarily need a local testnet to be doing this. The mixnet at the moment is fast and it's free. It's kind of fine to dev against, to be honest, because it's in a good state. If, maybe this is something in the future that if people are, wanting to have this kind of 3 mix nodes in a gateway kind of local setup to dev against, maybe we can look into, something like a Docker container or something like this as a developer tool. But yeah, I would say for the moment it's cool to use mainnet.
The next one is from Vincent, aka VinNextNodes. I have a mixnode related question. Can the mixnode be impacted negatively if any mixnodes refuse to update to a more recent version? If yes, will there be a measure to put in place to make people update their mixnode? This is a good question.
Yeah, so it would depend on the version. It would depend on the versioning, right? The versioning that we use with Nym is you have major and minor releases and then point releases. So point releases, in the case of 1.1.15, which we're currently at, 15 is the point. And the idea of how this versioning works is that everything that's 1.1 point something should be compatible with everything else that's 1.1 point something. So, for these little point releases, then it should be fine. We are aware that there's a couple of reasons that people might not be checking their mix nodes right now, updating their mix nodes. One of them is we're investigating a possible bug in the network monitor, which is basically the thing that sends test packets around and then dictates the kind of uptime score for a mix node on the Explorer. So we are exploring like a possible bug with that as well. And I'm aware that like some people, because we have a weekly release, but then there's this possible bug, so their uptime goes down for their routing score rather goes down for a couple of days. They don't really want to do this every week because it impacts their delegations. But in a situation where that is fixed, then there's a few approaches. One approach could be that you don't allow maybe mix nodes that are more than 2 point releases behind or something. They don't get selected to mix or something. that would then put an economic incentive for operators to actually stay up to date. If we assume delegators are perfectly rational crypto economic actors, which obviously everyone knows they're not, but you would maybe hope that people who were delegating to a node, if they saw that it was really out of date, would be like, maybe I'll move my delegations away. I don't know how much that actually happens. Hopefully both of those things have answered your questions.
When we first started investigating the impact of updates on routing score, I raised it on like one of our internal channels to the dev team, and someone told me, I can't remember who, but someone said there's even an argument for leaving nodes with a good spread of the point releases. So with the patches, I guess that's the like major release, minor release, patch, right? That's the structure.
Yeah, point, not patch. Patches are what you do when you realize you've got a problem.
Okay. All right. So then the argument was that it may even make sense to leave them on a spread of the points, because that way you can be resilient against any new bugs that may have occurred with a version release or something like that. Is that accurate?
You could imagine that as well. There's definitely something to be said for that too. I think this is something that once we're going to investigate this bug with the network monitor, but obviously in the next couple of months, then the decentralization of NICs also involves the decentralization of stuff like the network monitors, right? So we are going to be soon moving to a situation where you have you don't have a centralized network monitor that's looking at uptime. So I think, it only really makes sense to start thinking about that too much once that is kind of in place and once that's settled. And, you're making a complex system already a bit more complex. So obviously we'll wait to see how everything settles and make sure everything's running right with that. And I think then we can maybe look at this as well, but it's not too much of an issue for right now.
As it turns out, measuring performance with privacy intact with a system such as Nym is kind of a tricky thing. So Claudia has been researching quite some time, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Claudia is the one to ask about this kind of stuff, and obviously she's the person behind the kind of the crypto economic system behind the mixnet itself as well. Yes, this is very much her.
Yeah, actually, I'm making the mistake again of not fully introducing people when we're speaking about them. So we're talking about Claudia Diaz, our chief scientist and one of the co-founders of Nym, one of the OGs behind actually the project. All right, actually, Bep is elaborating more, I think, on one of the previous questions. Can a service provider address a Nym be constant over different gateway connections? If I want to expose a Nym service that's statically identified by something, how would I do it?
Yeah.
Like for hidden services, Tor hidden services, which comes up quite a bit actually.
It does, and it does for a good reason. Tor hidden services are dope. So, Beb, I'm going to answer your question in two parts. One is right now, one is the very soon future. Right now, no, is the answer to your question. And that is because if we look at the way that Nym addresses right now are actually generated, and I'm going to drop a link to the actual page on the docs as well when I'm doing this, and hopefully do some multitasking, or I'll just fail at both of them, but we'll see. Basically, right now, then the kind of Nym address that exists, which is this kind of big, horrible, long, well, it's kind of three strings. So it's like a big string, a full stop, another big string, an at, and then another big string. What that actually breaks down to is your identity key, the identity key of the client that you're talking about. And because all services run a client, then this is what we're talking about. The client that the service uses to connect to the mixnet and listen for messages and send messages. It's the public identity key of the client, the public encryption key of the client, and the gateway identity key, because that's how the routing works. The gateways are there to not only check when the mixnet is paid for, to not only check that people aren't freeloading, but also to act as mailboxes if a client goes offline. Because how you do offline message storage, it's an interesting question when we're talking about like private communication systems. So right now, then actually which gateway a client is connected to actually dictates its address. You could imagine kind of setting something up where you kind of used a client almost in the same way that people have load balancing infrastructure or something like this, which is also something like an interesting thread to pull a little bit further down the road. Why is this not going to be too much of a problem now? Or like, how could you set up like a static identifier for something like a service? Luckily, we are working on a kind of Nym DNS. John is working on this right now. and it's going to be a smart contract. So another Cosmos smart contract, and it's basically going to allow you to do something like set up domain net, like Nym specific domain names, which would not necessarily mean that you could have multiple gateways underneath it, but it means that you could change stuff up without having to re-advertise the endpoint of a service, basically. Same gateway publicly, same address. Yeah, so I mean, like your address is kind of like, your address is like the both public keys from the client and then the public key of the gateway. That's what currently constructs your address, basically. Check out pastenym as an example of how you set up a service as well, because they're dope. So do that.
All right. So another question from Nicola, actually. I think it ties back to something that we discussed earlier. So he's saying there's a lot of buzz around account abstraction within the crypto communities, Sismo Connect plus account abstraction. What use cases could exist within Nym to foster the value of account abstraction for privacy, kind of highly simplifying tech for the end user?
It would be interesting to see if you could combine. I mean, actually, this is a really interesting question, right? Because account abstraction is kind of when you have like I'm wondering if you could do this with coconut credentials, or whether that would be account abstraction. Account abstraction is something that's coming up. It's something that you are already starting to see on Cosmos as well, or like you're seeing people kind of talking about this too. Account abstraction is very often talked about with regards to crypto UX, with regards to like onboarding and like an ease of onboarding as well, right? Just having account abstraction in the Cosmos space alone would make it a lot easier to onboard people onto everything. Now, whether you could actually start, if you could somehow combine account abstraction and coconut credential generation and uses thereof, then that would be very interesting. I'm not sure whether actually you could think about credentials as a kind of a different form of account abstraction, in that you then are kind of like, you're having links to an identity, but that identity is never revealed. So possibly using zkNym for something like that. That could be really cool. I hope that vaguely answers your question.
To me, it sounds. I'm not sure about the technical definition of account abstraction, but it really sounds like something that zkNyms are all about, basically, or coconut credentials. Like that's the idea is, right?
With account abstraction, it's basically like let's say you can like program more security and better experience into the way that people use accounts. So if we're using the kind of Ethereum Cosmos EOA model, right, the externally owned account, that's like, the kind of the classic, that's the classic account model that you think of in the blockchain space, right? It's like you have an address, the address has a key pair, the address is generated from the key pair, you lose the keys, you're fucked. If anyone has your keys, you're fucked. Like it's this very all or nothing kind of thing. Whereas with something like account abstraction, you could start thinking about, maybe I have an account that I keep very, very close to my chest. And from this account, I kind of spin out this other identity. This other identity is maybe able to send transactions up to a certain amount in a month, or it's able to interact with like whitelisted accounts, or I have another one that I just use to sign multi-signature transactions. So it's kind of like spreading your eggs. It's not having all your eggs in one basket. That's kind of what we're looking at when we're looking at stuff like account abstraction, I think. Does that kind of help?
Yeah.
You could almost think of it as well as kind of like the smart contractification of accounts. So then it's also this thing where, you could just talk about this forever as possibilities and things, but basically what it is it's putting in kind of further abstractions and extra steps between you're completely safe or you've lost your private keys, right? It's kind of like you could set up like these little avatars with rules that can do stuff on your behalf and that you control. But if whatever one of them gets doxed, then it's like, oh, well, and then you just kill it. It's a lot more flexible. It's not this like all or nothing kind of model of accounts. So, you could imagine something where you have credentials. I mean, credentials are kind of brilliant anonymous access control thing. You could imagine something, I think, with Nym for that. I think account abstraction in general, depending on how it's constructed, obviously, but I think account abstraction in general is also great if it's kind of this Hydra model of privacy again, right? It's like you don't just have one head. It's like you have hundreds of heads that you can, if someone cuts them off, it just jumps up again. And in the private model, it's like you don't know which head is which or which person. So maybe my metaphor is, my analogy rather, is like falling apart around me, but maybe not.
It's fine.
So it really ties into just good privacy practices anyway, of like not linking everything to a single thing.
Actually, I'm going backwards with the questions in the wrong order. Sorry about that, but I skipped for some reason about 8 questions. I'm not sure why, but anyways. So Nick is asking about like 7 hours ago. He doesn't see a hackathon in the on our events page, and do we have a separate schedule for those?
No, we just don't have any hackathons coming up at the moment.
For context, when it comes to hackathons, Nick, is that as it turns out, they are incredibly resource intensive, both in terms of time and in terms of money to organize. I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Max, but we will have hackathons in the future, but it's something that we need to tie into some bigger things that are happening with the project.
I think this is also something that, now the Rust SDK is out, now that we're fleshing out the TypeScript SDK as well, as soon as these become a bit more robust, maybe, should we say, then it becomes a lot easier to start. It becomes a lot more an attractive prospect for devs to go to a hackathon and be like, oh, hey, cool, I'm going to hack on this thing, because it's just a library. It's just learning a library. Like any time you otherwise try and import some functionality into a project and you find out about this cool library that might help you do it. I think we're previously having a hackathon. We did a few. We didn't organize them, but we put challenges in for some of them, and we had some good things come out of them. But I think if, especially, something like organizing a privacy related hackathon, I think is something that Nym is only just kind of becoming an attractive prospect for devs in a way, because it might sound, I don't know, it might kind of sound a bit flippant, but definitely I think everyone has experienced this who's deving as well. When you find a library that sounds cool, but then if it's really gnarly to use, or the documentation isn't very good, or the SDK is maybe like really clunky, then you just don't use it ultimately. Whereas now we're getting to a stage where our SDKs are very slick, and as soon as the TypeScript SDK has a bit more functionality, which I can talk about like after finish answering this, then that's when it's the right time, I think, to then start running these kind of hackathons, because it's easy for people to plug into it. It's easy for people to come to a hackathon, find a team, find a challenge, something like this, and then they're going to be focusing on like one SDK library, and otherwise they're just writing logic that they probably as developers already know. So it's only kind of now that we're getting to the stage where I think hackathons would make sense to do. But that's just from the development side. As Sudo said, they are super resource intensive, especially if you're going to be running one. Also, as a one-man DevRel team, that means that no other DevRel stuff can happen for whatever, 3 days or a week or something, as well as all of the other accompanying like organizational stuff that comes around it as well. We're getting to the point where it makes sense now, but previously I don't think it really did.
Yeah, exactly.
What do I mean when I'm talking about the TypeScript SDK also being fleshed out? Well, right now you can only set up ephemeral key pairs. What it means is that you open a browser window that has the TypeScript SDK in it. A client is made for you, a fresh client with fresh keys, and therefore a fresh address. You use it, and then when you close the browser window, then they close the session, then that client disappears. And you can't currently load an existing key pair. You can't load an existing identity into the SDK, which obviously restricts the stuff that you can do with it. So this is one of the main things that we're working on now with regards to the SDK, is being able to manage key pairs properly. Obviously, managing key pairs in a browser is something you have to be really, 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 really careful with in terms of like where you're storing them and how you're storing them and all of this kind of stuff, because anything to do with keys touching a browser is always scary. So you just have to design it very well. So we're just taking our time with that to make sure that nothing bad happens with it. And the other thing that we're working on with the SDK as well is we're also working on making it work in the Node.js runtime environment too, which means that then you could also start using it you could build like Node.js backend stuff using the TypeScript client as well, which I think opens a lot of doors to a lot of other people who may be writing backends in Node, but don't particularly like doing browser work or something like this. So yeah, those are two very exciting things we're working on with the TypeScript SDK as well. And once those are done, I think, you can almost think of the mixnet component of the SDK as being kind of chunky enough to start building real stuff with. And then there's the other components that I talked about earlier, which will come in the future, the kind of coconut component for both the Rust and TypeScript SDKs, as well as the validator components.
Question is about, also from Nick, it's about UPA, the Universal Privacy Alliance. So for those of you who don't know, folks, the UPA is something that we co-founded. It's an alliance between privacy-focused Web3 projects, such as ourselves, and also Manta and Secret and many others. The question is, are we developing something together with other co-founders and members of the UPA, and whether we share ideas and know-how? Well, I know part of the answer to this question. I'm not aware of like co-developing something at this point in time. Maybe Max knows something I don't. But the primary objective of Universal Privacy Alliance, or UPA, was not really development focused. It's mostly communications slash shared message focused like initiative. The point of the UPA is that there are all of these amazing projects doing amazing work in different aspects of the privacy tech stack, like different points of the privacy tech stack. And we could just be working in our silos, doing our own thing, but at the same time, there's this shared message among these projects, the shared vision, which obviously is more amplified if we communicate it together. So that was mostly what ended up, what prompted us to start the initiative. So I'm not sure whether we're co-developing anything. Are you aware of anything, Max?
No, but like you said, the UPA has like a very particular purpose. Obviously, like the groups that are in the UPA, just in virtue of the fact that we're all privacy projects and privacy developers, then yeah, we have like intersections with. And those projects are also working in different areas of the application stack as well. Starting to set up demos and tutorials and stuff for those different projects for, how do you interact with Manta via Nym? How could you interact with Aztec via Nym? How could you use Nym to hide stuff that you're sending to Railgun? This is the kind of stuff that I think is good material for the hackathons, the future hackathons, basically. But right now, no, there's no like code development work.
Definitely. All right, so public service announcement. At this point, I have actually no idea which questions I asked and which I didn't, because I'm going completely random order. So I will ask if I skipped your question, then please just paste it again, because I lost track completely. But Turbitus is asking, you already answered this in chat, Mike, but maybe you want to riff on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's about moving the docs into monorepo. What the best way of making suggestions on the doc is. Basically, that's the question.
Suggestions in the form of like feature requests, or if they're little PRs that you want to do yourself, just whack them in. Basically, whack them in as a PR. The reason I'm saying this instead of DMing me about it is because I will forget, probably. Git as version control is absolutely sick if you are doing lots of things at once, because it's a non-blockchain based immutable history of what has happened. PRs, I'm always a fan of. Like if it's something very immediate, where for instance, if I don't know, some upgrade docs are like completely wrong, or like something quite immediate, then yes, flag it in channels, right? But generally, I would say the best way to do stuff is through pull requests and GitHub issues. And please just make them, just do it. I am one person, and I always like it when people say, hey, I kind of did a quick fix for the docs. Can you check it out? That's great. That's really nice. It's also really nice that people care enough to do it. One thing I would say is, like, if you're thinking of some like huge PR that you want to do, like, yeah, maybe DM me about it first, just to make sure that it's something that I would actually merge, just so you don't waste time. But for the vast majority of stuff, just like GitHub issues and pull requests are the way to go.
All right. The next question I think is the last one. Although once again, guys, if I skipped over any questions, then feel free to paste them again. But this is also from Bep, and I don't understand the question, so please help me out here. So I'm managing a Kates. I think that's how this is pronounced, a K8S. I'm managing a Kates infra that I would like to monetize deploying a mixnet node. I was not finding that much documentation about deploying a mixnet. I have to focus on the git crate nymtech /nym/mixnode. Is that correct? PS, read the examples of the Rust SDK, freaking cool. I read the examples of the Rust SDK, freaking cool.
Yeah, but Kubernetes is not really, and I've never really messed around with Kubernetes, to be honest. It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to your question, to be honest. There is a problem with Docker because of IPv6 connections. It is doable to run stuff in Docker containers, but it would require a bit of fiddling. This is something to maybe ask in Matrix, and then I can point Fran at it, maybe. People who actually play around with stuff like Kubernetes and Docker a lot. I don't really mess with them. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by monetizing deploying a mixnet node, because running it is how you monetize it, but maybe I'm just misunderstanding what you were typing. And yes, the examples in the Rust SDK are really cool. There is, there is going to be a coming soon. There is, I think, or maybe it's already merged. I'm not 100% sure. I can't remember, but it is floating around. I saw it the other day. There is actually also a piece of example code of how to interact with Coconut credentials on the testnet using the Rust SDK as well, which is cool. Oh, as in you can, yeah, cool.
All right, wait. I think I found one more question that I skipped over, actually. This is also from Nick. This is mostly a very serious question. So when metadata token airdrop, the NIM should distribute it to those who suffered from personal data leaks. Can we commit to this yet, Max, or soon TM?
That is actually quite a funny idea. I do kind of like that, actually. When Nix is permissionless and open for contract uploads, this is something you could hack on. Yeah, maybe it's something that you and a group of people in this chat could do as well as us. But yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think it's quite an amusing idea.
Yeah, keep us posted, Nick, on the developments. We're ready to amplify once the project is getting somewhere. All right. Well, I think with that, although I did see some people typing in the chat, so maybe let's give them some more time. But with that, I think we arrived at the end of the AMA and also the end of our questions, which is good timing.
Yeah.
Any closing remarks, Max?
Closing remarks. Everything is kind of just, there's a lot of stuff like very immediately on the horizon now, both in terms of the TypeScript SDK and also in terms of Coconut. The second round of dev grants will be coming soon. Yeah, I would say those are my only really closing remarks for now. Everything is like just around the corner, which is exciting. I can see Ethan Moore is typing though. I'm going to let them.
Yeah, I think the around the corner thing is a perpetual state.
I mean, it always kind of is, but these are all pretty big things now. You know, I mean, the decentralization of the chain is going to open up a lot of things. This is kind of a very big thing that a lot of stuff is hinging on. And by decentralization of the chain, what I mean, the decentralization of stuff like measurement infrastructure, but also the fact that you will then have validators who are part of the distributed key generation, which is critical for the security model of ZK NIMs and Coconut credentials. That's going to be the big thing. That's a big door.
So obviously not that relevant for this call because it's more of a tech/development focused call. But Nick's finally going decentralized and permissionless is right up there with Nym VPN. Let's call it that, as in a very important milestone for the project. So it is indeed very exciting that we're getting closer to it.
Yeah.
Wait, it is not a question that SMR said. The biggest thing you mentioned is the monitor functionality, because my mixnode score is definitely getting impacted when I restart the node, even for config changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is being looked into.
Yeah. There's maybe some bug in there. We're trying to work it out. It will be fixed. It's just, it's quite a strange system now as well. And also, yeah, it's this kind of thing where, as soon as we decentralize that bit of the infrastructure as well, the logic of how that works will change a reasonable amount. So that might also be a thing. New metrics, mixnode karma, combination of multiple performance metrics. Yeah, I mean that's all possible. Also, remember that the Explorer is open source as well, right? If anyone wants to hack on the Explorer, then always feel free. Tooling is, I think really a lot of this call has been about tooling, about developer tooling, about node operator tooling. And this is stuff that, yeah, there's some stuff you can obviously kind of think of by just sitting there and kind of pontificating about it. What would make it easier for me to develop on this platform or run a node on this platform? But there's some stuff that comes out of people actually doing it. So if there are ideas that you have as well, then the grants are coming up. Everything's hackable. Just go for it. Come to Matrix, say hey, ask questions, share what you're working on.
Actually, on that note, on the Explorer being open source and the hackability factor of that, too bad he's not here today. One of our community members, Palm Flake, he is developing a pretty cool Explorer, just as a case study. So he's developing something that captures data in the developer API, which is pretty, from what I understand, it's pretty slow to query. By catching it, it opens up all sorts of like new fun possibilities. Just besides, accessing all the data much quicker than you would be able to otherwise. And the Explorer is also doing things like calculating by what time will a node at its current rate of getting saturated will oversaturate so that you know when you need to move your stake and all sorts of other fun stuff like that. So yeah, you can definitely develop like more advanced and more fun Explorers. All right, folks. Well, on that note, I think I'm going to let everybody go. Big thanks for joining. I have one sad piece of news to share with you at the end of this DevRel AMA, which is that this time there is no pull-up because our friend Pizza J, who's responsible for pull-ups, was extra ultra busy with Talentland last week, so he didn't have the time to prepare one. But going forward, as usual, you will be getting a pull-up for every DevRel AMA and also community calls. Big thanks for coming, Max. We should do these more often, I guess, because it's never enough time to talk through everything.
We're only 10 minutes over time. That's good, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, today we only went over by 10 minutes, which is, I think, a new record. So we were pretty efficient, and we also covered all the questions. So really good job.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy keeping these things flexible. I think longer ones every other week is kind of nice.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not in a hurry either. I have no life, so it's fine.
Yeah, I'm going to be working anyway, so it's nicer to work and talk to all of you than just be doing stuff on my own, as always. And yeah, hopefully soon we will have some hackathons coming up this hopefully, and then we're also going to be involved with yes, we've also got some fun dev events coming up. There are a couple of possible Cosmos events that are very dev focused for any Cosmos heads, and we are also going to be at MoneroCon in Prague as well in the summer. So yeah, it's kind of far away, but if you're around Central Europe in the summer, then come through, come say hey, and come and hack on Monero and Nym together, which is a nice spicy mixture.
Amen. Have a lovely Wednesday, everybody, and catch you on the channels.